They want to annihilate the white people. So what they're doing is they're sending Muslims and every other colour into these white indigenous countries to delude the white people so the Jews can take over, but they're using the Muslims to attack us on the street right now.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 181 for the 12th of June 2025.
We're only seeing the surface of it now in Ireland. It's called the Kerridge Plan. Look up the Kerridge Plan. We're all going to be overrun. You know, they're going to take over the country. That's the plan. The plan is being set 20 years ago. They want to annihilate the white people. So what they're doing is they're sending Muslims and every other colour into these white indigenous countries to delude the white people so the Jews can take over, but they're using the Muslims to attack us on the street right now. The Muslims is only to turn their face from what's actually coming at us. It's the Jews, not the Muslims. But they're going to fight for them and they're going to attack us on the street. They've sent them here on purpose. What the plan is, they want to dilute the white race so the Jewish race and the Iraqi race will be the supreme race. They're afraid of us. They think we have no. I don't think any white race is any more better than any other race. This is their opinion, not yours. I'm telling you what the Kerridge Plan is. It's their own opinion. They're coming here, they want to dilute us all down. There's no white people left in any country, not just Ireland, any country. It's happening everywhere. Any indigenous white country, they're flooding with loads of men to have intercourse with their girls, and there'll never be another white child born. We're probably the last of the white Irish.
That's a clip I played on the podcast a while back. It's from one of the far-right protests a while back, and we've had a couple more of those anti-immigration protests in the last while. I saw some comments on social media about those protests, one in particular that caught my eye with some, let's say, unflattering photos of a group of protesters, and the comment was, "Not one junior cert between the lot of them." I'm certainly not going to argue that that woman in the clip or any of her cohort will be winning any Nobel Prizes, but I don't think that it's constructive to call them stupid. It might cheer the troops, but it's unhelpful for two reasons. First, it doesn't win any converts. That is a debate well worn. I'm not going to get into it. But secondly, it's dangerous to assume that everyone who doesn't agree with you because they're stupid. At best, that leaves you dangerously unprepared. And it's important to recognize that what you're hearing there isn't just random nonsense. There are clever people out there who are promoting very extreme messages, both overtly and covertly. I don't know if that woman was aware of it, but the version of the conspiracy theory that she is giving was created by a French far-right figure called Renaud Camus, who published a book in 2011, Le Grand Remplacement, The Great Replacement. Basically saying what that woman was saying, although Camus' book was specific to France. Renaud Camus, by the way, should not be confused with Albert Camus, who actually is a noted philosopher. Renaud Camus' conspiracy theory has been spread widely on far-right websites and adapted for many other countries, including, as we hear there, for Ireland. It is by no means original as a conspiracy theory. The Nazis had a similar concept, which they called Umvolkung, which referred to the supposed dilution of the Germanic people by Slavs in ethnically mixed areas of Eastern Europe, supposedly organized by the Jews. And in 1995, the American neo-Nazi David Lane published his White Genocide Manifesto, which claimed that civil rights for African Americans was a plot to wipe out white people organized by the Jews. And earlier, the American lawyer with, let's say, a deep interest in ethnic issues, Madison Grant, wrote a book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race, which claimed that the post-slavery migration of African Americans to the big industrial cities in the north of the US was an effort to wipe out white people organised by the Jews. You might be noticing a pattern here. Various incarnations of this theory have also been promoted by people on the fringes of polite society, including American journalists Ann Coulter and Tucker Carlson, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, French far-right politician Marine Le Pen, and it has inspired terrorism, including the 2019 attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, which killed 51 people, the 2011 attack on the Norwegian island of Utoya, in which a total of 77 people were murdered, and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people. This conspiracy theory, I think, is popular with the people who it's popular with because it satiates two racist desires for the price of one. They're denigrating the people seen to be inferior and sexually threatening, who are to be hated, and blaming people who are superior and to be feared, almost always the Jews, although in more polite society they're referred to as the liberal media elite or some other variation of that euphemism. The fact that a supposedly all-powerful cabal has been trying to wipe out the white race for more than a century with nothing to show for their efforts doesn't seem to strike these people. But I don't want to talk about those people. I want to talk about people who don't go in for the swivel-eyed anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. I want to talk about people who say that they have rational, reasonable objections to immigration, or objections to mass immigration, or objections to uncontrolled mass immigration, and who say that they're unfairly tarred with the same brush as the lunatic racists. They say that it's not possible to discuss issues like resource constraints, which are strained by the arrival of what they call large numbers of immigrants or refugees, and they want to talk about how some groups of immigrants are incompatible with the culture of the communities that they arrive into, and that integration of immigrants into wider society can be poor, or fail entirely, creating culturally isolated ghettos. I think it's perfectly fine to talk about all of these things. I also think that sometimes well-meaning people can shut down these discussions because, for them, the discussions resonate too strongly with racist themes, and issues that should be discussed calmly become taboo. The thing is, I also think that there are some clever racists out there who recognize that they won't get far ranting on about Jewish conspiracies, so they cloak their racism in a veneer of practical concern. So the well-meaning liberals who shy away from practical discussions around immigration aren't right, but they're not always wrong. At least some people talking about practical concerns are using it as a way to promote their own racist views. That doesn't mean they all are. That doesn't mean that the concerns aren't valid. But it's reasonable to look at people's track record as a whole and point out any inconsistencies. That brings me to Ben Scallon. Ben is undoubtedly a talented guy. I've spoken to him. We discussed it, but ultimately he decided not to come on the podcast, which is his right, of course. Ben's Twitter or X bio used to say that he is the son of a Dublin father and a Jamaican mother. These days it lists him as senior political correspondent at Gript Media, where he writes and posts video content frequently. Which is what brought me to one of the videos he posted in advance of last year's local elections. The set and the graphics on the video are done up to look like a news broadcast, and this is how he starts the piece.
The Irish government helping asylum seekers to vote in elections is a self-serving power grab disguised as a good deed. German philosopher Bertolt Brecht once famously said something to the effect of, "The people have failed, we must elect a new people." And this is a sentiment which the Irish government seems to have taken very much to heart.
He goes on to explain that what he is referring to is the fact that, unlike with Dáil and presidential elections and referendums, there's no citizenship requirement to vote in the local elections. And Ben frames this as an attempt to fix elections by buying immigrant votes with supposedly luxury provisions for asylum seekers.
Apparently, the Irish government wants people from all over the world who don't even speak English, let alone Irish, to vote in their droves by the tens of thousands to decide the future fate of our local democracy. This is also a cynical and Machiavellian ploy by the government to retain power under the guise of being inclusive, whatever that means. Either way, the government has done those people a favour that they likely won't soon forget, because who gave them their brand new modular homes and luxurious hotel rooms? Well, the government did. And so who are these asylum seekers going to reward with their vote when the election comes around, most likely? Well, the government parties that have given them their new life, right? So in effect, what the government has done here is import tens of thousands of likely voters. As the governing parties consistently drop in the polls with native Irish citizens, they are bringing in a new electorate, knowing that many of those people will likely vote for the establishment and the status quo.
There's no doubt about what Ben means to say here. He's saying that the government is taking active steps to change the composition of the electorate to the advantage of themselves and of immigrants at the expense of indigenous Irish people. To be fair, Ben covers his ass with one quick comment in the piece, and I want you to listen to it carefully.
This has actually been a policy in Ireland for years, believe it or not. Anyone ordinarily living in Ireland can vote in local elections whether or not they're a citizen. Refugees were given the right to vote in Irish local elections in 2004. In fact, if an asylum seeker wanted to run for the locals next year, they'd be perfectly entitled to do so legally.
Did you listen carefully? Did you hear Ben say that non-nationals were given the right to vote in Irish elections in 2004? Because actually he didn't say that. He said,
this has actually been a policy in Ireland for years, believe it or not.
And he followed it up almost immediately with a reference to a small technical change that was made in 2004, which could leave you with the impression that that's the for years that he was talking about. And if you got that impression, you would be wrong. Very wrong. Wrong by more than a century. The Local Government Ireland Act of 1898, an act of the British Parliament, which obviously controlled Ireland at the time, was an act that created Irish local government more or less as we know it today. That says a lot about how much Irish local government needs reform, but that's a rant for a different day. Before 1898, there were various property, gender and other qualifications that were required to vote, but these were not put in place for the elections to local authorities. At the time, there weren't really any citizenship requirements to vote because the concept of citizenship didn't really exist in the way it developed in the 20th century. Passports weren't required to travel. It just wasn't a thing. And basically, that never changed. Ireland isn't so unusual in this. Other countries that give the vote in local elections to non-citizens in one way or another include Argentina, Belgium, Bolivia, Brazil, Cape Verde, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Estonia, Finland, France, Greece, Iceland, Jamaica, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malawi, Netherlands, Norway, Paraguay, Peru, Portugal, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Korea, Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, the UK, the United States, Uruguay, and Venezuela. So what Ben characterises as an evil plot to thwart the will of the Irish electorate by importing hordes of dirty foreigners is actually nothing. The Irish government has not changed a provision that dates back to the time of British rule and is common around the world. And I suppose I could just leave it there. A misleading scare story that has literally nothing behind it. But I think that that just isn't it. Because a common complaint that you will hear in anti-immigration circles is that immigrants don't integrate into Irish society. At the time of recording, the Gript website has more than 300 stories mentioning the word integration, mostly stories bemoaning the failure or inability of immigrants to integrate. A good chunk of those stories were written by Ben himself. And here he mocks this supposed lack of integration.
One has to ask how an asylum seeker who isn't even able to speak the language of the host country can possibly make an informed decision about who to vote for. For example, I don't speak one word of Slovenian. I couldn't name a Slovenian political party if my life depended on it. And so if I moved to Slovenia tomorrow, does anyone think that I'd be able to cast an informed vote on the issue of the day? Well, obviously not. An Irish voter wandering into a Slovenian election would be incredibly easy to manipulate because they wouldn't know any better.
Let's leave aside the error that he could vote if he just showed up in Slovenia tomorrow. You have to be a resident and you have to get on the electoral roll, which both can take several years, because what really gets me on this is that they're trying to corner immigrants into a no-win situation. If they don't integrate, then that proves that they're bad. And if they do integrate and perform their civic duty and vote, or God forbid, actually put themselves up for election, then they're part of some dastardly scheme by the globalist elite to rig the elections for Manorhamilton Urban District Council. And it's worth remembering that, at the end of the day, the electorate get the chance to decide on the fate of the candidates in the election, be it for Manorhamilton Urban District Council, or for Dublin Bay South, where Ben was a candidate for one of the far-right splinter groups himself in the 2020 general election. He got about half of 1% of the vote. In a moment we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon, and especially to Brian O'Connor, who gave a very generous donation since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron on Patreon. It lets us know that there's people out there who are listening and who appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media, and you're more than welcome to listen for free. But if you think that you could do the same as Brian and the other donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter, but most of all, tell your friends.
On the line, I have Kev Collins. He's a YouTuber from Cork. He produces videos with an incredibly high level of production values. They're very impressive visually. And Kevin, your most recent video, as we're sitting here recording, was about Coillte. Coillte is the Irish nationalised forestry company. Tell me why that attracted your interest.
Thanks, William. I spend a lot of time outdoors and in nature, and there's not a lot of it around. So the story is bigger than just Coillte. It's really about how Ireland manages its land and its resources and its future. Mm-hmm. And Coillte is tasked with managing an incredible 7% of the country's land. And there's been a lot of issues, and I think it all came to a head last year in 2024 when they sold or partnered with an English investment fund called Gresham House. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people aren't familiar with that. And so I really wanted to shine a light on it, and just to see how much damage has been done from the monocultures that we see as forests. I think there are Irish people who go walking in the forest and they think where they are working is a normal, healthy space. But in reality, it's an ecological dead zone. And if they, had an experience in a real forest, they would really have that comparison. So in the video I made, I really tried to show that, filming in the monocultures, filming in very few of our native woodlands, to be able to show people the difference. Mm-hmm. And Coillte has been allowed to operate like a private logging company with very little public scrutiny. And I think because we're in a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis and a housing crisis, forestry sits kind of at the natural intersection of all of those. And if we get it right, there's huge benefits. We're talking about clean air, rural jobs, flood prevention, and a nation getting back some self-respect. In that episode, I opened with a line which I thought was poignant. But when we reclaimed the land, a century ago after the War of Independence, we never got to reclaim it spiritually or ecologically. And I think 100 years later, that's really starting to show.
One thing I remember from my geography lessons in school about 150 years ago was that the statistics, if I remember them correctly, was that at the point of independence, Ireland was 1% forested. And that was like compared to Germany, that was about 30 or 35% forested, which seemed an unbelievable difference. In the time since independence, we've gone from about 1% to about 8% forested of just the land area of the country. Is that entirely Cuilcha? And in the way that they've done it, and you've, I think, talked about monoculture in the sense that we're just growing Sitka spruce all over the place. How could that be done better?
Yes, it's even worse than that. So, I mean, the overall forest cover has increased, but the native forest cover is actually still less than 2%. So when we talk about increasing the percentage, it's increased by less than 1%. So, the vast majority is Sitka spruce. So at the moment, how we could be doing it better is by simply purchasing land, which charities are doing. So there's great work by a charity called the Gaelic Woodlands Project, and other ones as well, Reforest Nation, and they do a one-time permanent restoration. And Cuilcha is caught in this cycle where they lease land from farmers. There's no long-term incentives. So usually after kind of 35, 40 years, the land is clear felled and the farmers will go at it again. So there's no permanent restoration. Everything is very short term. Short-termism is what it suffers from. So to increase the percentages, we just need a system of permanent restoration. And in 2019, Cuilcha had a non-profit green arm called Cuilcha Nature. And this was to be the area that focused on habitat restoration, wetland restoration, and bringing together all of these things that people had been talking about for so long. And ultimately, last year, that was quietly folded back into the main business with no explanation. So really, when I look at that, I see that just as a box-ticking exercise that went nowhere. And in the interim time, in the 6 or 7 years that passed, very little changed, and now we're back where we began, and we're looking into a real problem. I think with changing climates, the trees that we used to be able to grow here may not grow here so well in the future. So we really need to think fast.
And what I was impressed with in your video was that you kind of put that in the context of essentially the failures of the Irish state, which are mostly failures of imagination. Can you maybe step through that, why that is happening and exactly what is happening for the listeners?
Absolutely. I've coined a phrase. I think it's appropriate, but the state is ambition deficient. I mean, there's a huge deficiency when it comes to vision, to having anything long term. And I think where we're caught is that civil servants and the government really incentivize the wrong things. They incentivize short-term profits. There are no incentives for holistic long-term solutions. They're caught in the cycle of 5-year elections, and they will do what they can to make sure that they can get to the next 5 years or the next election or the next election, but they don't do anything that will leave a permanent, good mark on the country.
One of the things I've seen in your videos, without meaning it as a criticism, it does seem you're coming very much to a lot of these issues that you cover, a few of them centred around Cork, but you come at them from a fairly left-wing point of view, and in particular advocating that more power be given to local authorities. Would that be a fair assessment of your own views?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I think there's a great author, Dr. A. Quinlivan, who I saw speaking in Cork City Hall recently. He's published a few books on Ireland and how it's run, and it is one of the least democratic countries in the developed world. Because when we vote for our politicians, they don't really have the power that they need to move things forward or make these changes that we want to see in society. So when Coillte sold the forests in 2024, people were rightly outraged, and that extended through to the politicians as well. So at the time, there was Doyle debates about how this had happened, and at the end of the day, the deal still went ahead because the politicians have no power. So everything is removed from public scrutiny because it's a semi-state body. And that's done by design. That's the likes of Todd Andrews and Ray Burke, Fianna Fáil figures from several decades ago set up the institutions in a way that actual power and is removed from the public. The politicians almost act as a layer of shielding. So giving power back to local authorities would be a great first step. And in doing so, they will be able to, at the moment, when we have charities filling the void where the work the Coillte should be doing, they can plant forests, and then it's looked after at a community level. So that's really where it comes. There's a more of an ownership, there's more of a responsibility, and I think ultimately that leads to more success as well when you have community level initiatives, whether it be forest planting or whether it be at the civic level. There's a higher value and there's higher buy-in from locals. Whereas if it's somebody sitting in offices hundreds of kilometers away who doesn't have a feel for the local area, or who simply isn't going to be that invested in making sure that the right plan happens for the local area, then it's very hard to put a cohesive blueprint for a country together.
That sounds good. However, I think that Ireland's experience doesn't always chime with that, and that in particular, you're relatively young, and I guess you've had the experience that I have of politicians kind of beating their chest, saying that power should be devolved down to, and local authorities should be given more responsibilities, and never doing that. Isn't the experience with Irish local authorities one of just catastrophic incompetence all the way through? For example, student grants, water, housing, driver licensing, penalty points, and since you mentioned Ray Burke, planning, all of these were areas that were controlled by the local authorities, and most of them, except for planning, those powers have had to be taken away from local authorities just because of the level of incompetence. Is it possible that, for example, if you were in business and you've been, I know, worked in private companies, any department in a well-functioning company, any department that is underperforming will very soon find its funding and its responsibility very severely cut back, possibly with a view to eliminating that department. Why is that different for the public authorities, where we have such incompetence in local authorities? Why is the solution to that to give them more power?
I think the advent of technology has come along since the last time local authorities had a sense of power and had the ability to make these decisions. And I think with that comes more efficiencies, more streamlined processes, and more transparency. If we're talking about the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, when local authorities were in charge of all of these things, then the system to get stuff done would have been much longer, because there was no email. There was none of the tools that we use today that really have excelled business. And I think at the end of the day, where we are now, things are not exactly any better. I still see a stagnant state, but I just see it run
in local authorities and governmental agencies. You're talking about
in governmental agencies, yes, absolutely. And I think something does need to change. I also think I'm not 100% sure, but the funding that councils get is something like 8%, where they can administer that locally. So perhaps it was more in the past, but if you don't have the budget to back up the initiatives and the ideas, then solutions will tend to be reactionary and never quite visionary.
Yep.
So we do have the money now as well. So even if we had, bumbling incompetence with local authorities in the past, we probably didn't have the funds to do very much with whatever we were hoping to do. Flip the page now, we're in a very unique situation where we do have a lot of money, and that's, going to be a moment in time thing. That's not going to last forever.
But even cash-rich companies, to compare them to private sector, even cash-rich companies will be very, very quick. A failing department, even within a cash-rich successful company, will very soon find itself either drastically reduced in scope and budget or actually just closed down. Isn't that true?
Absolutely.
And why should that be any different and there's a lot of incompetence in lots of areas of the Irish government, but I think it is underappreciated how much of that incompetence is focused on in local authorities.
It's an interesting perspective, and I suppose really our expectation should be that our local authorities would be able to deliver effective services if they were given the opportunity and the money. I don't think that because it wasn't effective in the past that we shouldn't try again. I think the opposite. I think there should be a second chance for this with all of the new tools that we have and with an appreciation that this is going to be an opportunity and we do want to see local authorities sink or swim. And I think if, power and money is given to local authorities and they perform badly, then just like you're saying, if we were a private company, we need to have a system of moving people in and out of roles very quickly, not the lethargic way that government bodies tend to move when it comes to people, but very rapidly. If we can see some areas excelling in certain areas, like all of a sudden Limerick, it has really got a handle on the housing crisis and they've put in new strategies and they're turning a corner, but Cork is not, then we can learn from other areas. We can see what other places do well and then emulate best practice within the island itself. And that is a process that is done across Europe, across different cantons. And Switzerland would be a good example of where they have this decentralized model. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but when we do see it's not working, we do need to act, right? We don't want to sit in a stagnant situation where we see it's not working and we do nothing for 5 years and then the power is centralized again.
Limerick now has a directly elected Lord Mayor. This has been presented as a cure for many of the ills in local authorities. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about the fact that that is very, very slow to be reformed? And do you think that that has the potential to move in the reforming direction that you are suggesting?
Yeah, I feel very sad because Cork doesn't have one and we were given the opportunity to vote and we voted against having a directly elected Lord Mayor. And I remember listening to some of the discourse at the time, and I think a lot of the arguments on the local radio stations was that it would cost a certain amount of money and that put people off. And when I see the calibre of people who applied to be Lord Mayor in Limerick, you have, I guess, people with quite a back catalogue of success or bringing ideas to reality. So it goes to show that I don't know yet exactly how successful it will be, but I do think it's a step in the right direction. I think anything that's giving more power to local authorities is a step in the right direction.
You hope the people of Cork will be proven wrong?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. On this one occasion, I'm happy with that.
Okay. The two other videos of yours that I've been watching, one of them that I want to mention briefly is talking about Ireland's housing crisis. Give me the elevator pitch for what you're talking about there.
I talk about resources mainly. I talk about using the timber that we grow. We export a lot of that, and it's not, we don't have, so the real pitch, I think, is that we've missed out a load of these tertiary industries because we have foreign direct investment that is pouring in. But as a result, we haven't built a lot of the advanced sawmills that we would need to be generating things like glulam, cross-laminated timber, things to build modular homes. And I'm just back from a trip in Vancouver, and I've seen this construction all over the place. You know, the the city is awash with cranes, awash with building, and all of the high rises and everything, maybe not high rises, but up to 4 to 5 floors are these wood panel builds. So I talk about using our resources that we have growing out of the ground to try and reduce some of the costs here. And I also talk about hempcrete, which is made from the woody core of the hemp plant, made with a lime binder. And that's a building material. I think we have about 50 homes in Ireland. There was an episode on Nationwide, I think, that looked at it. And it's a fantastic building material. It's a low carbon negative material compared to concrete. It is as strong as concrete. It can be used in multi-story buildings. The United States has updated its building regulations last year to try and pave the way for more hempcrete adoption. And it also gives farmers a lifeline. If we had a whole new industry that we could be giving farmers to grow hemp, which grows great here. But again, we have no tertiary industry. We have no hemp fiber processing plants. So any of the hemp that we grow, we only use the seeds to turn into hemp oil. And then either the rest gets discarded or sent to France or the Netherlands where it can be processed.
Understood. And then the other video of yours, which is titled "The City on the Edge of Forever," which is about your native Cork. You have to tell us how Cork is on the edge of forever.
I'm obviously a huge Star Trek fan, which is where I lifted the name from. But I feel there's an infrastructure project here, and it's a state level one again. It's from the OPW, and perhaps this is where part of my mistrust of semi-state and state bodies come from. These ideas coming from Dublin to Cork, and they're large concrete infrastructure projects that will reshape the city. And this one in particular, the River Lee is the river that flows through Cork, and on occasion it floods. And the solution is to put it in a concrete tube from the west of the city until the east of the city. But there are already 2 dams on the river, the Carrigadrohad and the Inishannon Dam. And so these used correctly could be used to mitigate flooding, and a tidal barrier then is the solution that locals would prefer.
Kev Collins, YouTuber, producer of very, very high quality and very high production value videos on YouTube. Look up Kev Collins. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much, William.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Kevin on Instagram at kevin.rob.collins. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to Brian and all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you could throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.